So bear in mind that I am not the I being referred to here. This is very much MaryAnne's work. But I wanted to just read what she'd prepared because I think it provides a really nice foundation for the conversation we're going to have this evening. So yesterday's discussion, arising from three strong contributions from myself, Bart Pushaw, and Jennifer Ramkalawan, raised some key issues both by our speakers and from discussion from attendees. Firstly, the search for a national language of art in the Nordic countries from the second half of the 19th century, and the call for moving beyond this concern to consider Nordic art within the context of transnational boundaries and environments. Secondly, colonialism and its impact on the making of art by European and indigenous peoples, which raised the question of the validity of the work created by the European artists who sought their motifs in territories subjected to colonial rule, Greenland, Sapmi, and more broadly, the question of appropriation. And thirdly, more generally, raising the profile of Nordic art beyond individual nations, bringing it to an international audience. So as a backdrop for a continuation of these discussions, which will, I feel certain, come into play in today's presentations, I thought that I would just touch upon MaryAnne's own engagement with primarily the first of the two issues, namely the search for a national language of art through my own work, exhibitions, writing, and teaching, with particular reference to the Danish artist Wilhelm Hammershøi and Norwegian painter and printmaker, horticulturalist, landscapist, environmentalist Nikolai Astrup. Both artists raised the question of the periphery and the centre, namely the recognition that there was a need to seek to express the distinct character of their respective cultures through their art, but at the same time, the need to hone their artistic skills and be aware of manifestations of new modern art best located in primarily Munich and Paris. They sought to be modern, but carved out their own individual responses to the increasingly strident array of modernisms. Hammershøi found his individual voice via Whistler to create a world of simplified form, silent, timeless, poetic interiors, identified in the early 20th century as the true manifestation of the modern. Astrup, despite consciously rejecting Christiania, the centre of art in Norway, on his return from Paris in 1902 and returning to Western Norway to Jølster to devote himself to the celebration of the rugged beauty of the mountainous terrain, the distinct qualities of light and the clarity of atmosphere in paintings and innovatory woodblock prints, remained throughout his short life very aware of the most recent developments taking place on the continent. From Cubism to Kandinsky's abstraction, informing himself of these, critiquing them, and absorbing aspects of them to create an art which showed no signs of being derivative. See his Spring in Jølster, after 1925, with its multiple perspectives, bold colour, simplified elements of the landscape, dismissal of traditional perspectival recession. Neither artist was known outside their native land, although Hammershøi was exhibited in London and in the Scandinavian Modern Art Exhibition, which toured the States in 1912 to 13, and Astrup's radical prints were shown in group exhibitions in the States in the 1950s. I was committed to raising their profile internationally. This was done with the Hammershøi exhibition at the RA and in Tokyo in 2008 to 09, extending familiarity of his work following the exhibition in Paris and New York, and by two Astrup exhibitions, one in 2016 to 17 at Dulwich Picture Gallery and Emden, Germany, and in 2021 in the US at the Clark Institute and in Stockholm at Valdemarsudde. The Hammershøi exhibition provoked the making of the exhibition Hammershøi in Europe at the SMK in Copenhagen and Kunsthalle Hyperbank Stiftung in Munich. Astrup is almost certainly having his third international outing in Japan in 27 to 28. Both artists were male, yet it would have been possible to raise the profile of female artists, of which there were and are so many excellent practitioners, thanks to the social support and access to training which they had and have. The task has been started in this domain, collective exhibitions, for example, two of which were presented at Valdemarsudde, Ljusets Magi in 2016, at Eget Rum in 2021 to 2022. And I'll also add here personally Kvinnliga Pionerer, which took place at Valdemarsudde last year. These have included significant numbers of female artists, and some female artists have been either accorded their solo exhibition or formed part of a select group of artists. Harriet Backer exhibition in Oslo and Musée d'Orsay in 2023 to 24, Helena Schäfbeck at the Athenaeum and at Valdemarsudde and Göteborg Konstmuseum in 2012 to 13, at the Royal Academy in 2019, and in Japan in 2015 to 16. Anna Anker in DC, and another planned for London, and one more planned for the Norwegian artist Kitty Shelland. More exposure has been accorded to more contemporary artists, about which we will hear more from Leslie. Likewise, in more historical contexts, publications such as Carina Rek, Becoming Artists, Self-Portraits, Friendship Images, and Studio Scenes by Nordic Women Painters in the 1880s, published in 2022, signals the wider and growing interest in Scandinavia's female painters. So, changing hats. That is my turn to now add to this what is, I think MaryAnne highlights a very rich and growing conversation around Nordic women painters that perhaps many of us, I think when quantified in the way in which MaryAnne puts it together, really just shows how they are having a moment, and it needs to be more than this. And so obviously last night I briefly mentioned sort of the Northern Lights paintings and glacial paintings by the artist Anna Boberg. And that was my sort of main introduction to her work. However, over the years, I have become increasingly obsessed with her fishing scenes. And I think many of my colleagues poke fun at me for being the art historian who is both obsessed with North Sea fishing and ships. That's a different conversation entirely. Well, almost. So I thought what I would spend the next few minutes talking about is the work by Anna Boberg. Many of these pieces are actually currently on display in London and provide a perfect way of introducing her preoccupation with the Lofoten fishing community. And so for a bit of context, for those of you who might not be overly familiar with the prevalent fishing industry in Arctic Norway, Lofoten has historically been a very prominent space for cod and herring fishing. This was prevalent during the late half of the 19th century and continued into the early 20th century. And what I argue is that Anna Boberg is working at a time where traditional fishing, that is the use of open wooden boats, the Nordland boat, is sort of coming to an end. She comments on this herself. She sort of laments the modernization and mechanization of fishing. And that is the introduction mainly of steam trawlers, where sort of the local fishing boats become replaced mainly by steam trawlers purchased by Britain, but more on that later. And what we see in her work is an attention to these fishing boats. And so she comments on these two types. There's the smaller boat, and then there's the hunting vessel, as she refers to it. And we have an example of this on the left. And sort of this scene of the boats in the harbour is very prevalent within her work. She establishes a studio on the hill in Svolvær overlooking the harbour. This is following her first visit to Lofoten in 1901. For context, she travelled to Lofoten regularly over a period of 30 years. So that is why we see such a prevalent attention to this region. And I think it's important to note that Lofoten, despite being a Swedish painter, Lofoten and the Norwegian Arctic is the theme and the sort of the environment that attracted her the most within her work. And so what I've been really interested in over the years, and I will actually say less so in the book, I actually had already written a paper on this and felt that there was only so much people needed to hear about my obsession with fishing. And I think Ben and Rachel can attest that I in the catalogue essay, get very much carried away with this idea yet again. But I think what's really interesting is that we see the role of fishing within the landscape. We see this sort of industrial element that is really becoming industrialized at this time. In other works by Boberg, we see herring oil factories that are being built along the coastline being depicted by her, whale oil factories, the sort of ancillary industries that grow out of the cod and herring industry. And so that is where this painting on the right, as I argue, sort of comes into play. The Blue Roof, again, on display here in London right now, is a really interesting example for thinking not about the boats, not about the fish, not about the people involved, but about the infrastructure that grows up around these industries. Here we have the harbour, we have the storage houses, the warehouses that are being built up along the coastline to support and facilitate this industry. And Lofoten is providing most of the cod and herring to Norway at this time. And I'm realizing now that you've probably all come here not realizing you're going to get a lesson in the Lofoten fishing industry, for which I apologize. And so, and I mentioned before, again, this kind of lamenting the changing tides of the fishing industry. And so View from Lofoten here is much more reflective of earlier works by Lofoten painters such as Gunnar Berg, Otto Sinding, who are working within Lofoten at the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, and are very much caught up at this specific moment where steam trawlers are overtaking and are forcing smaller rowboats out of the industry. And Gunnar Berg, for example, creates an incredible scene that reflects on a specific moment in which steam trawlers quite literally blocked access to the fishing waters to sort of control access. And so we see in Boberg's work a lot of these scenes of the fishing vessels moving in and out of the harbour, resting on the docks. And what we don't see perhaps as much of is the human element. And so I couldn't not include today this photograph of Anna Boberg posing in her own little boat called Puttan, which she had during her time in Lofoten, which allowed her to fish for herself. She did go out with other fishermen, but she also talks of going out to slightly away from the harbour areas to the less densely populated areas of Lofoten, where her and her husband could fish in isolation and enjoy the Arctic landscape. And I think the other thing that is also important to note is just how important painting from the boat was. She devises an easel that she can attach to her body that will allow her to stand up and paint from a moving vessel. There's a fantastic photograph that's both on show in the exhibition here in London, but also other scenes, photographs that are more readily available online, in which this easel is strapped to her thighs and to her waist to provide her with that stability to paint on plein air. And so I think we get this real idea of how important the boat was, how important fishing was to this artist, who very much saw this as an opportunity for her to perhaps controversially take on the more local sort of persona, much to the chagrin of her French colleagues who write, you know, what are you doing dressed up as a fisherman in the Arctic and not here in Paris in your beautiful gowns? But again, I think this is a really rare example, though, of where we do see the human and the fish. We have the silvery scales of the fish caught in the net. We have the fishermen working in this industry. And it's actually this painting which inspired me to think about the Faroese artist, Frida Zachariasen, who is working mainly during the 1950s in the Faroe Islands. She is born in the fishing community of Klaksvik, which is a small fishing community, and again deals mainly in cod and herring. And she is brought up by a father who is a fisherman. She marries a fisherman who tragically dies within their first year of marriage in Aberdeen. So you can now see how I've gone full circle. And but what's really exciting about these two paintings is that we're really seeing the involvement of women in this fishing industry. So at this time, already by the 1930s, women are intimately involved in the processes of fishing. They are following in Scotland, in Iceland, in the Faroe Islands. They are following the fishermen along the coastline. They are the ones who are on the shore preparing the fish that is caught, splitting it, stacking it, drying it. And that is the process we're seeing taking place here. So it might not be immediately discernible, but these sort of triangular shapes on the floor, on the ground to the left are that of cod that has been split and passed open. And again, we can see a sort of a cod being held in the hand of the figure on the right. But what's even more interesting with Zachariasen is in the early 1950s, the first Faroese bank goes bankrupt because they have bought too many steam trawlers from Britain, and then the price of coal has soared. So they are no longer able to operate these steam trawlers, and the local, more sort of the traditional modes of fishing have already been depleted because of the replacement of steam trawlers. And the fisheries unions go on strike. The Women's Fishing Union, which is established in the late 1930s, goes on strike alongside the men to support their protest. And these paintings, especially Fiskagentan on the left, is produced the year the strike happens. And so these paintings are not only important for how they comment on women's involvement in fishing in this sort of North Sea and Arctic region, and within the Nordic region more generally, but also sort of very much making a statement on women's involvement in the fisheries. And I just wanted to again include this painting, which I think parallels really nicely with Anna Boberg's work for thinking through the sort of the juxtaposition between the traditional vessels and the steam trawlers as they exist in the landscape. And so with that, I'm going to end and pass on to Charlotte.
Thank you very much. Great. So from that deep dive into an individual artist, I'm going to talk over a number of different women practitioners, just to give some sense of that long picture over time of the role of women in the story of the modern in the Nordic countries. So there'll be quite a few different names, quite a few different slides, but I've got a theme for each slide. So the first is this issue of professionalization. The fact of comparatively early access to professional education in the fine arts and in craft and design for women in the Nordic countries, for just a couple of decades ahead of most other European countries. That is foundational for the role that these women can go on to play. But there's a continuous story through this sort of long 19th into the 20th century of women being both inside the professions and outside the professions, being included, but it's provisional, it's precarious, it's often tied to marital relations with other practitioners, or to remain single and live a single professional life. So there is this interesting story, I think, for the Nordic region of being in advance in terms of the inclusion of women in professional practice, but it's not all plain sailing by any stretch of the imagination. So here we have two fine artists. Amelia Lindegren is one of the first women admitted into the Swedish Royal Academy in 1864. And then Helen Schärfbeck was in the Finnish School of Drawing. And she's sort of an example of someone in her early years winning prizes, winning a travel grant to Paris, alongside and against male students, able to build up a professional career. And then the other theme for tonight of nature, in relation to women practitioners, there's an interesting paradox, both of women artists and designers working with nature as a theme in exactly the same way as their colleagues do. But at the same time, there's a parallel story of the construction of femininity and the role that women played for their male colleagues as being part of nature. So these two slides showing two women who are married to artists. So Karin Larsen being depicted by her husband Carl Larsen, and Marie Kreuer being depicted by her husband, in a way that emphasizes obviously the connection to nature, the connection to the home, the nurturing aspects of this idea of femininity, but also showing them within the home, which they substantially designed, the furniture, the textiles in particular. Both of them were active as designers after marriage, at which point they had substantially set aside their fine art ambitions on the basis that they were married to artists and didn't want to compete with them, but turned their creative energies towards design. But there are also women artists who continue to work with nature as a theme that was hugely prominent and important for the construction of Nordic modernity, picking up some of the themes from the first introductory talk about the building up of new national art cultures in all the Nordic countries at the end of the 19th century that involves turning away from the academy, the classical antiquity as a model, and searching for new models This happens across Europe, but within the Nordic countries, it has a very strong national inflection, as for various reasons, each nation needs to redefine itself culturally and re-establish or establish for the first time a national art culture based on institutions like the founding of a national gallery, the founding of art schools, and design museums, and all of that. And a connection to landscape, and the idea of craft embedded with landscape is a theme that we'll follow through this evening. But I also, with this slide, show another important aspect of this theme that links to this alongside the national, or permeating the national, is the transnational, and in particular, East Asian art, which was filtering into Europe, particularly into Paris, where all the different artists I'm going to show you and designers spent time going to Paris, encountering Asian art, graphic art and textiles in particular, and ceramics, that opened up all sorts of new discourses in regard to how nature might be treated, how nature might function as a modern language, which the foreignness, the unfamiliarity of the East Asian art made it feel modern, even when they may well have been looking at material that was relatively antique. But it felt very modern, it felt very new, and that the ability to, as you can see in these landscapes, marry the capturing of a particular Nordic nature, time of day, season and mood, with something that is also clearly referencing this very new, fashionable, challenging interest in East Asian art. And alongside that, so the interest in nature can also be married to less romantic ideas about nature and more into the sciences. And with Hilma af Klint, we have both the idea of the hard sciences in her work as an scientific illustrator, among other paid work that she undertook. And then, so the lack of a clash between that and the spiritualist work that she did, shown here, of mediumistic painting that uses some of the lexicon of scientific imagery, as many theosophists did, as part of their effort to concretize and give visual form to these numinous experiences, and understanding of the world. So as science was having massive new breakthroughs in terms of understanding of the atoms and magnetic force and magnification, was showing that actually the world was not how we all thought it was. The theosophists could use that same language to say, no, it's not at all how we thought it was. It's also these other things of resonances and spiritual leaders. And now going over to design and architecture. So here are two examples of early professional architects in Scandinavia, women architects. Vivi Lund was the first architect Finnish architect to have her own practice, to practice professionally for the whole of her career as an architect. And you can see that both of these architects are working with themes that were common across the profession, of looking at vernacular buildings and looking at materials that were rooted in the natural landscape. So the influence of English arts and crafts, in particular in the art and design schools in the Nordic countries in the late 19th century, informs that sense of how the building should sit within nature, and the use of materials, so Vivi Lund's very rugged granite stone was in line with that development in Finnish architecture at the time of using the Finnish bedrock granite, which is very prominent in the landscape, to give a Finnish identity to new buildings that were otherwise, in terms of structure and plan and function, like a fire station, built based on European models. I need to speed up. My time is running out. Frida Hansen. So this craft connection works on, again, on a number of levels. If we think back to the folk craft revival, the interest in the local people, the peasants, and the collecting of their artifacts is important in the building of national identity. The construction of femininity made this association with women practitioners a very easy one for a lot of women to step into. But with an artist like Frida Hansen, and I'm going to go on and show a few more, it's not simply a replication of folk motifs. She also went to Paris and Cologne, and visually innovative in her work and technically innovative in the development of transparent weaving. And as we move into sort of the heroic period of Scandinavian modernism, women practitioners are still practicing. They are admitted into the art and design schools. They are graduating with qualifications. They are working within professional studios. A few of them, like Aino Aalto, achieve. So she was the lead designer for Artec, the furniture design, applied arts design company founded with her husband and with Maria Gullitzen. But many of them worked more anonymously within the big design manufacturers. That another thing that the Nordic countries did that promoted design was all the industries had professional art departments in a way that American industry, for example, did not have, and hired people out of art and design school to design for them, which was very successful. But the theme of nature continues in the theme of how materials are used: glass, stone, wood, ceramics. So these showing how these women designers, who might not be household names like Aino and Alva Aalto, but whose work is showing in the Design in Scandinavia exhibition. You can see from the catalogue there, it's being reproduced. So they were participating, but often not remembered. And I think that's maybe the last point I should end with, that there were a huge number of practicing women artists, architects, and designers in the Nordic countries through this sort of 100 years that I've galloped through. And they were permitted by society to practice. Their erasure is subsequently more to do with what happens in art history, what happened to do in the art museums, and the construction of national art histories in the Nordic countries in the interwar period, where the contribution of these women falls out of the story and has been started to be reinserted by sort of heroic feminists in the 70s, rediscovering these people, and now is building momentum. And it's not only an issue in the Nordic countries. Across Europe, there were lots of professional women artists in the 1890s and early 20th century who have fallen out of the story. And this is now changing, which is exciting. And yeah, so I will end now.
Thank you. So at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle, where I serve as chief curator, we explore the Nordic connection to nature. In fact, fostering connection to nature is one of the museum's 4 core values, informing what we collect, exhibit, and consider through our programming. To tease out the themes relevant to this evening's discussion, I'll present recent and upcoming exhibition and installation projects by living Nordic and Nordic American women, or, as in the case illustrated here, contemporary works that reflect the Nordic interest in nature. In the latter category is American artist Jenny Ruffner's project Aurora, a brilliant 6-meter tall wall of ever-changing light that recreates the effects of solar wind on the Earth's magnetosphere. The piece is comprised of 34,560 individual LED lights and relies on real-life images of the aurora borealis, specifically those observed in Iceland. To create the work, Ruffner partnered with video game pioneer Ed Fries, formerly of Microsoft and father of the Xbox,
and gaming specialist Dr. Wanda Gregory of the University of Washington. Ruffner is perhaps best known as a glass artist, but in recent years, she's experimented with AR, VR, and AI. With Project Aurora, the artist and her two collaborators have asked the machine to dream within the parameters that they have set, as opposed to sequencing or looping images of the aurora. The result is spontaneity. Aided by AI, Project Aurora offers an artificial recreation of a natural phenomenon. According to Ruffner, she says, quote, creating a representation of this most elusive phenomenon required a lot of equally complex technical expertise. My hope is that the Aurora Borealis's incredible beauty, created by just wind and atoms, inspires humans to be aware of the beauty of the natural world and their impact on that beauty through their individual impact on the physical world, end quote. Originally installed as a temporary exhibit, the museum announced its acquisition of the piece in May. From AI to stop motion animation, Swedish artist Natalie Björberg draws inspiration from Nordic folklore and its representation of a natural world teeming with human-like creatures. And I should just note, for the last 20 years, she's partnered with Hans Berry, who creates the corresponding soundscapes for the films. In the films The Dark Side of the Moon, a pancake moon illustrated here, and Howling at the Moon, Björberg and Berry's contemporary fairy tales are set in an ominous forest with a curious cast of characters. All three films are screened in an upcoming show that we'll have at the National Nordic Museum called A Place of Opportunity and Transformation, opening next month. The exhibition's tongue-in-cheek title references the film's setting, this fantastical forest in which the narrative's protagonists resist and fall victim to opportunistic predators on their journey or search in vain for answers to life's great mysteries. What we see here in A Pancake Moon depicts the life cycle of an anthropomorphic egg. At the beginning of the film, the young egg proclaims its potential. The forest is a site of delight and self-discovery. However, a bear and a wolf appear. They have designs on devouring the innocent egg. To evade its predators, the egg transforms into a moon, and it takes on a mottled appearance, slowly deflating. Ultimately, the protagonist lies flattened like a pancake after suffering verbal assaults from the figures below, and it lies on the forest floor, which may be seen as a reference to gender roles and dynamics. The end of the 6-minute film shows a newly formed egg alone in the forest. The cycle will repeat itself. Alternating between hospitable and inhospitable, the environment shapes the experience of the egg. Another artist duo, Las Hermanas Iglesias, or the Iglesias sisters, considers how cultural traditions and place inform identity. For Lisa and Janelle Iglesias, 2 of 4 sisters born to a Norwegian mother and Dominican father, art making is truly a family affair, with their mother Bodil and Lisa's son Bowie often contributing. And that was the case in 2021 when we presented Mother Tongues, Bodil and Las Hermanas Iglesias. The artist translated motifs from one medium into another, a dialogic call and response, that characterize or has characterized their work since they were in graduate school. Works on paper become knit paintings, stretched on a canvas over wooden bars and hung alongside their frame sources of inspiration. In this form, the knit works blur the lines between functional and fine art, which until the late 19th century had been largely closed to women artists due to limited access to formal artistic instruction and exhibition opportunities. References to the transfer of knowledge in their own maternal line abound. They include textiles made by their mother Bodil and their grandmother Sophie in their installations, and they also reference another mother, the mother of modern textiles, Annie Albers, in their work. However, of special interest here are their landscapes. The exhibition featured a photograph and knit painting of the Rondina Mountains. The sisters invited their maternal cousin, Hannah, to share photos taken in Bodil's hometown and surrounding sites. Among them was a view of Rondina National Park, which inspired Bodil's knit painting seen at left. Appropriately, she interprets the landscape of her childhood through a technique she learned from her mother in her youth. It becomes personalized and imbued with the artist's memories. The photograph makes clear that the process is one of artistic translation. Adopting a different technique with landscape photography as source material, Norwegian artist Anna Boberg combs through archival collections and joins scientific expeditions to the far reaches of the globe. Her work considers the landscape we've inherited and the documentation over time. An upcoming exhibition at the museum next spring will present paintings inspired by the historic and recent photographer Hannah Restvoll Holmsen, and focuses on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard. The work of this kind of pioneering photographer more than a century ago, alongside more recent photographic records of glacial recession and ice calving, is really what inspires Furunes's work. Her focus is on the effects of the climate crisis, which are magnified and multiplied in her monumental format and her unique technique. Her perforated paintings on the canvas are singular images that resemble the halftone process of printing multiples. The landscape figures prominently in the work of Levon Bell, an artist scholar based on St. Croix, an investigator of the legacy of Danish colonialism in the landscape. In her Cheney series, she examines archaeological fragments, pieces of pottery that surface in the soil after a heavy rain. They are symbols of Denmark's participation in the transatlantic slave trade and plantation economy of the Danish West Indies. Other works, such as this installation on the Service to the Kingdom from 2017, depict the landscape. Here, Bell references a plate with an image of St. Thomas Harbor from the dessert service of Frederick VI. It's created 1834, 1835. Upon examination of the plate, Bell observed that the image was off. It was, in the artist's words, a fiction, and the Caribbean signifiers were added by an artist who had never visited. They had been consulting a lithograph, of course. The service was intended to convey Denmark's territorial holdings. It would have served a dish rich with sugar imported from the Virgin Islands. Bell made the decision to paint this image on 45 paper plates, and as art historian Michael K. Wilson observes, that the decision is, quote, symbolizing the utilitarian, disposable nature of the colonial project, end quote. Moreover, in the use of collage here, the landscape references the artistic synthesis of sources for the plate. The piece is currently, as I mentioned, on display in the exhibition, Levon Bell, A History of Unruly Returns. And we shift from an artistic exploration of external colonialism to internal colonialism with the work of video artist Maria Hollander and her highly acclaimed 2018 Birds in the Earth film. It was shown in the 2021 exhibition, Among Forests and Lakes, a masterpieces from the Finnish National Gallery. Sami dancers are shown in the built landscape of Helsinki and the natural landscape of Sapmi. They alternate between two environments, wearing the attire of ballerinas, as well as their gakti, Sami dress that is a powerful symbol of cultural identity. According to Hollander, she was, quote, interested in combining the strict and disciplined art form of ballet with wild Arctic nature to show the contradiction between Sami people and the state of Finland concerning the ownership of the land and the sovereignty of Sami people, end quote. And this last example is from a 2023 exhibition, Wayfinders, in which Icelandic artist Steinunn Thornsdottir conceived of an installation for the built environment and the museum's architectural narrative. She has responded to the architectural narrative and the design of the building, which evokes the natural features of the Nordic landscape, most notably a fjord set in a valley surrounded by steep cliff walls. It also recalls transatlantic migration and the hull of a ship. 13 life-size aluminum cast figures are woven into the museum's existing curatorial narrative of this journey from the Nordic countries to Nordic America. During Thorndottir's creative process, the story of her great uncle, Frederick Sigurdsson, who left a remote farm in East Iceland to create a new life and identity in New York, Brooklyn, more specifically, and become a barber named Fred, came to her mind. Despite the personal connection, she's considering travels and resettlement abroad generally, and though the artist's two sons are models for her work, the sculptures are anonymous forms that highlight connectivity and the universal human experience. So I want to thank you for taking this walk with me through recent exhibitions and installations at the National Nordic Museum. This is by no means a comprehensive or exhaustive presentation of the theme of Nordic and Nordic American women and the environment, but the number and variety of examples shown in a span of 5 years suggests that this topic is fertile ground for exploration.
Thank you both so much. I feel like we've had enough from me, so I really want to turn the attention to the pair of you. I'm really struck following our conversation yesterday about we talk about breaking away from the national, but I think what we've really seen is less of that conversation, more the broader internationalization of Nordic art history and curatorial practice that we're seeing today. I think I wish Bart had been here to see you sharing Laverne Bell's exhibition, which is really exciting to see that being brought into the way in which North America is engaging with its Nordic heritage as well. And I'm wondering if you can both speak a little bit more to how you're dealing with this not resurgent, but this delayed and rightfully growing interest in women artists from the Nordic countries, both in research, teaching, and curatorial practice. Because obviously, with Charlotte, a lot of what you're doing as well is teaching this work. And I think we've seen a real shift in the kind of material we're teaching in Nordic art history. And I'm just wondering if you could both touch a little bit more on why are we now seeing so many Nordic women artists at the National Nordic Museum? Is it a conscious effort to correct the narrative, or is it just the growing number of women artists that are being brought up correctly, and the same in your work?
Thank you. I think that I mentioned the feminists in the 1970s. So Scandinavian feminism in the 70s was very strong, and art history was quite a strong subject area. So this work started to be done, and the institutions started to put on women's shows or start to address a little bit earlier than they did here. So that when I started teaching this material in around 2010, there was something to work with, more so than many other areas. So I think that's a structural ground for why these women had some few people's work started the ball rolling. And then as more widely we start to address the marginalization in the history of women practitioners, there's a thread to pull already, and books and exhibitions following on from that.
Well, as noted, women have been creating art, and in my interest as a curator, both in this role and prior to this, has been to expand the curatorial narrative to be inclusive. And so that has informed the projects that I've pursued. So I wouldn't say that there are more women artists, but but certainly, you know, the time is now to celebrate the work of women artists and to really consider all artists who have been historically sidelined for one reason or another, to tell a more complete story of art history.
I think with that, we have such a wonderful audience here this evening, so I think we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Silke, do you want a microphone? Do we have any questions for our panelists?
Sorry, it's a really obvious question, but I don't think it's been addressed. Is it that, I'm just asking about the theme of tonight's panel, and thank you very much for the 3 fantastic contributions. But I mean, is there a particular connection with women and the environment to do with the women artists engaging more with the environment, to do with their marginalization? Or is it simply that these are 2 major growth areas in current scholarship that are being addressed because simply they're both current growth areas? Or is there a deeper connection between these 2 topics? Sorry if it's a really obvious, banal question.
Well, I think for me, the interest emerges from a more general interest in Nordic landscape painting, which was sort of more the focus of my conversation yesterday, or my presentation yesterday. And it was in a sort of an effort to sort of rectify the sort of historiography and how we've told the history of Nordic landscape painting. And so I noted yesterday that the 1912 to 13 exhibition of contemporary Scandinavian art that tours the US, which was this major effort to represent Scandinavian landscape painting, only included 2 female painters as sort of being engaged with landscape painting. And something I've really been trying to do with my work is showcase actually how many women are engaged in landscape painting during sort of the 1819 to 1930 bracket that is my focus. And obviously, as I represented today, sort of extending that into the 1950s. So I don't think for me it's sort of saying that women and environment are sort of inherently interlinked, but more that women have been engaged with the environment throughout the history of Nordic landscape painting, and that in not sort of discussing their work within this larger context, we're forgetting sort of their contribution and their perspective. And I think bringing that conversation for me into the 1950s with the Faroe Islands, where there are very few female painters working, especially with the very prevalent fishing industry. And if I'd have had the time, I think for me, it's really indicative the way women are seen as engaging with the fishing industry in the Faroe Islands. And so one of the main sort of paintings is of a woman on the coast, painted by a man on the coast, looking out to sea as the fishing boats depart. And it's sort of this sort of lamentation of the men leaving to go out and fish. And I think what we actually see in the work of someone like Frida Zachariasen, who's painting around the same time in the decades that follow, by Mykines, who paints that scene, is that women were actually involved in the fishing, and that women were conscious of women's involvement in the fishing industry and a need to sort of resituate their presence in this environment.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that I agree that women were not particularly especially involved with landscape or nature as a theme, but that by putting them together, we can emphasize that they were participating in these themes sometimes in the same way as their male colleagues, and sometimes in not the same way, not the right way, in the same way that, for example, working class artists didn't do it the right way, and the reasons why there are certain big name hero artists who depict the national landscape in the right way, and those artists who are women or working class or other marginalized groups whose representation of the landscape or themes of nature didn't fit that nation-building nationalist narrative. So I think we can open it out into sections.
So one thought that I had, in earlier work that I've done that really focuses on landscape and 19th century is the importance of watercolor as a medium and the connection to nature amongst women artists. But I'm so glad to kind of pivot to something you mentioned, Isabelle. You talked about this scene of a departing fisherman and the effect, like the emotional weight, and how women are portrayed in the kind of a fisher family, right? But that changes with Anna Boberg. And I was really curious when you were talking about community around her. And I thought specifically of an American artist, an African-American artist, William Henry Johnson, who moved to Kertemina, spent the 30s in Kertemina in Denmark, and kind of entered into a community of fisher folk, depicted them, joined them. There's a wonderful image of him actually making a further trek to Lofoten. But I'm just kind of curious about that community around women like Anna Boberg.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the really interesting things, and we have a lot of this sort of understanding of her involvement in Lofoten from her in her autobiography, where she sort of talks about the fisher folk in Lofoten being really confused as to why, especially initially, and while we don't have this kind of temporal framework in her autobiography, she's terrible for her lack of use of dates. But there is definitely a clear narrative in the way in which the community kind of accepts that she's there and that she actually wants to get involved, and that she's not a sort of city socialite in the way in which she might first come across. And I think it's really indicative. And there's this fantastic passage where she writes about sending her husband back to Stockholm and that she's going to stay in Lofoten because she just wants to paint. And this is in the early 1900s. And, the travel there and the travel back, and the fact that this is very much a conscious of, I want to be here. I am part of this community. I'm going to get out onto the boats, help the fishermen. I'm going to paint from the boats. I'm going to have my own boat in which I can fish myself. I think is really interesting. And the fact that she also builds this studio right in it's in sort of a bit of land that juts out and splits the harbour in two. And she builds the studio up on the hill, sort of overlooking. So she's intimately connected with the harbour. She's always in that harbour space. And one of the things that I think is really apparent is that she's really, you can see this throughout her work, the sort of continuity of motif, that she really knows the community. She really knows that fishing community, which I think makes her really interesting. Because a lot of the other artists that we have painting Lofoten during the late 19th century, early 20th century are from Lofoten. And they're either, and if they're not from Lofoten, they're visiting Lofoten briefly, going away and painting it. And not in her case, where she has 30 years of constantly returning to this space and painting this space. And so I think it's a really interesting example of an artist who kind of makes a place their home, and then in a really unique way in which she sort of participates in sort of the community in a way that is perhaps unexpected for a woman during this time. Thank you. Any other questions? Erica, we got,
Just thinking about women artists in the earlier period, say late 19th century, early 20th century, what was the reaction to them commercially? Did they have success on the art market? Were their works appreciated in and of themselves? Were people able to dissociate the works from their sex? Thinking about France in this period, often men are very surprised to see a work by a woman and learn that it's a woman. first and foremost. So there's really an element of surprise that these women artists are so good. Is there a same reaction in the Nordic areas, or culturally are people more accepting of the talents of women over this period?
I can have a quick go on Anna Boberg specifically. So she's really interesting because she doesn't really garner that much recognition in the Nordic countries. A lot of her success during her career is international. So she's exhibited at the Venice Biennale 4 or 5 times in the first 20 years, so sort of 1909 to 1930s, I can't remember the dates. But she's included in the Venice Biennale several times. Paris is where she has her most successful exhibitions. She's included in several touring shows that take place in the US, where we know that her work is specifically commented on by critics and by artists alike, and work is purchased. So one of the things that I learned recently was that the University of Kansas owns an Anna Boberg. I learned this in the middle of giving a guest lecture on Anna Boberg, that was purchased following the Pan-Pacific Exposition in 1915, where her work was again shown before it toured as part of a Swedish art exhibition in 1916. So we know that her work is being purchased internationally already in the early sort of 1910s and 1920s, of Lofoten specifically. But she's a bit of a misnomer because she doesn't, and I think this feeds back into a conversation we were having last night about why has her work not been given the attention it sort of deserves, given how much of her work exists within Swedish collections specifically, when she's had this international recognition that lasted throughout her life and career.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up Paris, because Paris, all these artists study and work there. And in Paris, the women could not attend the academy, and it was quite new, quite different from the Nordic countries to have women artists. And the reception was quite positive. Whereas by the 1890s and early 1900s, women had been in the art schools for a number of decades, and there was a little bit of a backlash, or it was no longer novelty or cute to have women artists. And so it could be quite precarious to establish a profession. There were commercially successful women artists, but there were also a number who gave up or who transitioned into more commercially reliable portrait work or still lives and stopped competing for the big prizes. Or quite a number of artists who stay in Paris. Vibeke Hansen has done a book on Swedish sculptors in Paris, women sculptors, who could go and practice sculpture there. And there was such a novelty that they could do this very physical, very, carving great big life-size classical sculptures, and stayed in Paris, but don't make it into Swedish art history because they are not working in Sweden. So it's a very mixed picture. And in terms of their reception, their gender is always remembered. The journalism will always talk about lady artists, and will talk about Mrs. male artist, who's also showing some paintings. And scholars have also uncovered a tendency in the criticism of female artists to explain that they're overly influenced by foreign currents, so that women artists studying abroad and bringing these international currents into their native art worlds are often they're too permeable, they're too easily influenced, and therefore they're not Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Finnish enough for the critics.
Yeah, I just thought that that those points were so nicely made, and that I'd expand with an example. So not a Nordic woman artist, but an American artist who was raised in Utah and went to Paris to study with her husband, James Taylor Harwood. He went to the École des Beaux-Arts and she went to the Académie Julian. an alternative route to acquire additional academic instruction. They both painted alongside each other. She focused on still life. He created genre scenes in which her still lifes are very clearly informing aspects of his compositions. They exhibit together, for instance, at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. He shows in the Fine Art Pavilion, and she shows amongst the women artists. And you see in all press accounts, she's mentioned, but it's always as spouse of and separate from.
Hi, thank you. First of all, thank you for putting together this panel. I guess I have less of a question, and hearing all of the recent commentary, it feels more like a call to action right now, because we've been scratching, a lot of Scandinavian art historians have been very familiar with working with a lot of these artists. And I feel Americans, Europeans, we're all kind of coming to this and getting a little deeper, of course, with the Paris connections, right? These artists who are going back, leaving France, going back to their homelands and forging careers. I'm thinking of Fanny Herberg working as a critic, right? Or many of them starting art schools and having to pave their own way. And I just think, I feel coming out of this with all of us in this room, there is a call to action for us to really engage with these women's, their work, their career, the conversations that have been buried for decades and overlooked. And I hope as our overlapping circles of curatorial work and academic work, just will bring more of these stories to light. There is so much there. There is so much potential. And again, that we're uncovering so many, I don't know. I guess I would love to see more of this. I mean, there's so many stories to be told. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Beate. I work for the Tangen Collection, which is an AKO art foundation with Philip Lawford here from the AKO Foundation. I just wanted to make one comment about Nordic artists. The Tangen Collection, we are the only pan-Nordic collection. We have about 5,500 works of Nordic artists, modernist artists, the earliest from 1911. And right now at the Kunstsilo, where the Tangen Collection will find its home in Kristiansand, a newly opened museum there, you will see about 620 artworks from the Tangen Collection, of which many women. And some of them have been found, whereas others were there the whole time. So not everyone was never forgotten. That's my first point. Some were brilliant and very famous all the time. Another thing is that the modernist women painters or female painters who went to Paris and Berlin, Nell Walden started the Sturm, Ragnhild Kaiser, they were all under Lecher or Matisse, first under Lecher. They all stayed there. They were one of the best ones. Prisco Clausen painted, finished loads of Lecher's paintings, etc. So there were brilliant Nordic female modernists in Paris and in Berlin, typically. But when they came back, that was the problem, because nobody wanted to buy their work. But there are many of them, and they are being found. Lots of research are going on. There are fantastic exhibitions in the Nordic countries of female artists. So it is happening. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that, Beate. I think what's really interesting about some of what we've been talking about here as well is both this element of the forgotten, and maybe the word I used earlier, resurgence, is in some ways fitting, because, for example, an artist like Anna Boberg was known in the early 1900s, and then in 1912 internationally was known and thought of in this context. For me, in my research, thought of in this context of Nordic landscape painting. She was an artist who was considered to be important to showcase. And I think you touched on it perfectly, Charlotte, where you said it's sort of the art historian who's forgotten about it. in the last, in the second half of the 20th century, well, sort of post-war period, where we've forgotten about it because it was happening. And I think for me, I think there's been a lot of work now happening, but within the work I do, the frustration has been in almost going back to what was being done in the early 1900s. I'm sort of talking about an exhibition, that Luminous Modernism, which took place in the US in 2012. So 100 years after the 1912 to 13 exhibition. And what really struck me with that exhibition, while it was fantastic to see those works brought together again in the US, was the fact that it was only 2 women artists that were shown, and it was the same 2 that were shown in 1912 to 13. And I think that sort of Erica's sort of call to action is that there is, in these kind of more traditional histories of Nordic art, that we need to go beyond what has already been done and do a bit more legwork there. So thank you for your comments.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's, the challenge for how we do art history and how we think about what the stories are we want to tell. Art history is a discipline with its roots in nation building. So it has been unsurprisingly very hard for us to unpick that. All our institutions and collections, with certain exceptions, tend to have a national focus. So there are sort of structural problems to breaking outside that. But the networks among these women who were friends with other women artists, and these are transnational across the Nordic countries, but also across Europe. So we're discovering Helen Schäfbeck paintings in St. Ives that have been in someone's room for the last 100 years because nobody here knew what that was, even though she was, well embedded in Finnish art history. So it's going right back to unpicking what kind of an art history we want. And then it will be easy because, as you say, the evidence is there. They were in all the newspapers, they were in all the reviews, there were exhibitions, they had careers. So it's all there when we go to tell those different stories.
Could I ask Charlotte Ashby for a clarification? There is one Nordic woman artist who is of interest to us today by a factor of 10, by a factor of 20, Hilma af Klint, whom you mentioned, and you described her later works with a single word, mediumistic, as if she is simply channeling something. And if you or I were to channel the same spiritualist stuff, we'd come up with the same thing. I think that's a kind of inadequate explanation of Hilma af Klint's achievement. And I wonder if you'd expand on that.
Oh, yes. I was talking as quickly as humanly possible. So I was, when I said mediumistic, that was a way she described her practice, but she was a professionally trained artist. And so when she was trying to express a new form of visual experience, it wasn't what I would have been able to do, or just an untrained person having a spiritual experience. That she brought in her professional art training and her professional practice as an illustrator, and her color sense, and a whole lifetime's worth of, because she's working on those all the way through her life, lifetime's work of professional experience into these artworks. I'm not suggesting that they are not true artworks or anything like that, just that her understanding of it was of a different manifestation of her creativity to some of her paid work, but that is also framed within the wider structure where she didn't feel able to exhibit that material and had it ring-fenced to not be shown to anybody until many decades after her death. So that sense of vulnerability that I would connect to the often very harsh critical reception that women artists felt. So she would have known very well that these artworks were not like what other people were showing. And without the support network that certain male artists built around them, of having champions and critics and colleagues who would explain in manifestos why their stuff was important, she was not networked in that same way. And so for her to have put on an exhibition would have been, yeah, did not think, I think, feel possible for her as indicated by her desire to keep her work private until long after her death. But thank you for the opportunity to clarify that.
Thank you so much for this discussion. Sorry. Despite of being Scandinavian and art historian, I don't actually know so much about Nordic art, so it was really interesting. This thing that came up several times about how there's now a surge in academic interest in Nordic art and curatorial. I wonder whether these artists are kind of tend to be studied as a group and Nordic art as a sort of subgroup to art history, or whether it's more about bringing forward artists who have connection to the Nordic countries and bringing them into sort of a grander narrative of European art. And also whether you think it's helpful to sort of label them as Nordic artists. And that last question is a bit linked to sort of the debate now, whether we should call female artists or artists who identify as female as sort of women artists, or whether that can also be a bit limiting.
It's a challenging one to, as soon as we start to group them as women artists or female artists, are we not doing something adjacent to Mrs. male artist exhibiting, that we put their gender to the fore? So there are different ways of doing it. Might be to think about networks of people, because with these, for example, artist colonies like St. Ives or Grèce-sur-Loing, these were a mixture of artists from different countries, male and female artists, lots of mixed backgrounds who were intentionally taking themselves out of the academy context and the big art schools to like go away together and co-create. So telling stories like that focus more on the networks and the way the different actors from different places work together would, I think, be, and some networks were women only, but would be a way to not group them just as, here is a women artist show, and it's a little bit like the Women's Pavilion, where they just get their own little space.
Yeah, I mean, I can add on my whole thing is that I don't even tend to think of just Nordic art history. I tend to think in a bigger picture. And I think for the sake of these 2 days, it's actually been interesting me to return to think of Nordic specifically, because I'm so used to thinking in a circumpolar context, which is my area of expertise, and how I like to frame my study of landscape art history, and think it's a really useful way of thinking about Northern traditions of landscape painting around ideas of environment rather than around ideas of nation building. And so for me, I'm coming at this very much from that perspective, from these are women who are working in landscape painting, in this case within the Nordic countries, but more generally thinking about women who are working in landscape painting at a time where men are dominating the narrative and the collection interest. I mean, again, the other extension of my work is thinking about Canadian landscape art history during the early 1900s, where it is very much the group of seven, a group of 7 white men who are being purchased by the National Gallery of Canada when it opens to be representative of Canada. They are being put forward as representative of Canada. But as we all well know, another artist that ends up in St. Ives is Emily Carr, from the west coast of Canada, who is very current, who is a contemporary of the Canadian Group of 7, and is only one of, I mean, Yvonne McCaig-Hauser is married to F.B. Hauser, who is the main sort of critic of the Group of 7, and is an incredible landscape painter in her own right. And I think a similar conversation could be had about the wives of Canadian landscape painters in the early 1900s, who similarly are major proponents of landscape painting and are actually telling stories about the environment that the Group of 7 are very much aware of and just completely ignoring. Yvonne McCaig-Hauser is really well known for her scenes of radium mines and of mining along the shore of Lake Superior. So that's just to say that, you know, I'm very much coming at this not as a way of we need to frame women separate from men, or that we need to see women within just a Nordic context and but more generally in the way in which we reevaluate landscape art history, we need to allow the landscape and the environment to lead those conversations in some regards. And in doing so, we end up becoming more expansive and comprehensive in the way in which we study these fields.
I couldn't agree more. And I did begin my talk by talking about an American artist. I think that this is very much an international conversation, but I also think that the frame can be very helpful to point out cultural emphases, for instance, the influence of folklore, for instance, and the connection to the environment, you know, what certain attitudes like free loose leave, like how does that inform one's connection to nature that can come to the fore by framing it in that way.